I start? Okay. Well, finally ready. I think to start. Welcome everybody to this Cañada Blanch event. That is one of the many events that the Cañada Blanch Center at the LSE organize. And today we have a very interesting topic, which is natural disasters in the European regions. And natural disaster happens actually global, more and more and more. 87 million people in Europe are exposed, and I have actually the sadness to say that my own country, Italy, is the one with the highest number of vulnerable people for natural disaster, 20 million, followed by a series of other countries in Europe, but obviously Europe is not the only one. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Simona Iammarino. I am a professor at the Garrido Science Institute, but also attached to LSE, where I work for almost 15 years. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the really great outstanding speakers that we have today for this event. And that is Professor of Environment and Development. He has been here for a very, very long time. And he has probably, he has done everything at the LSE. He's currently, Eric, I have to read because the title changed over time. So he is LSE Vice President Planning and Resources, as well as LSE Deputy President and Vice Chancellor, right? I mean, I don't need to go into the details of all these speakers because their publication record, research record, outstanding career is known to everybody. Then we have the pleasure of having Professor María Dolores Pitarch Garrido, who is Professor of Human Geography in the Department of Geography at the University of Valencia. And again, you can check an outstanding record of research, publication, policy, career, and titles. And finally, we have the director of the Cañada Blanch Center, Andrés Rodríguez Pose, professor, is Princesa de Asturias Chair and Professor of Economic Geography, again at the Department of Geography and Environment. And again, a long list of publication and titles. So we will start this with an overview of some of the research that Eric did on natural disasters. So a sort of academic perspective, followed by two case studies, quite well known, unfortunately. One, Valencia, very recent, the flood, and another one in Italy, much more, a long time ago. It was 2009 when the earthquake struck the city of L'Aquila. And so, I hope that there will be then a lively debate, because these things, unfortunately, are happening even more for climate change reasons, but not only. And it's something that is very much geographically situated, has obviously this kind of events are disruptive for certain spaces and places. And so the geographical perspective matters a lot from an institutional, political, economic resilience point of view. So without further ado, because we are already late for the technicalities, I pass the floor, to Eric here, or you sit there because you have a pointer.
I could also stand, but I think I can. I can. This on? It was on. And I speak loud. I'm used to speaking loud that people can hear me. Thank you very much, Simona. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. Thank you very much for calling me, reminding me, if you like, a professor of environment and development. I haven't heard it in a really long time, but it does remind me that I actually at least was at some point in the distant past an actual academic. So mine will be sort of an overview. It's very general. It's sort of at the, if you like, global level, and then I think that leads very nicely into two much more. They're the experts. Mine is sort of very much a sort of abstract level. If you know anything about this field of study, you have heard this before, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. There's actually no such thing as natural disasters. They're natural hazards, but they turn into natural disasters because of the interventions of human beings and often the failure of human beings to intervene. They cannot always be prevented, that's for sure, but they can always be mitigated. And the question is, why are they mitigated in some and oftentimes not in others? So if we look at private individuals, they unfortunately face significant incentives to underinvest into prevention and adaptation. There are many reasons for that, but three of the more important ones include much of the mitigation and prevention is a public good, can only be done via collective action, and of course individuals face significant problems organizing that. They have significant information asymmetry. The experts, the government, they should know. Private individuals often are somewhat ignorant of, and I don't mean that in a bad way. They just don't know what the hazard ratio is, what it is that they get themselves into. They are also, however, once they know about things, they also show often myopic behavior, i.e., they think, I don't want to spend now protecting myself against some future unknown risk. Let's just enjoy the now. And then disaster strikes and things turn out very, very different. So governments could, in principle, of course, intervene and correct this market failures, but very often they don't do either. The reasons are, again, manifold, but they do include a lot of governments around the world. They have very...
What upwards? Is it here?
Huh?
You go ahead. I'm just making sure people online can see this.
Okay. I just need to be on the right one for me to see. So a lot of countries and their governments have very limited political, economic, and bureaucratic capacity to deal with that. So if you travel the sort of less developed world, so many things don't work, so many things are dysfunctional. It's not surprising that they're not well prepared for natural disasters. Prevention and mitigation policies are very costly, or can be very costly, and it is actual money being spent today. Whereas what you insure against is, of course, that uncertain event, that uncertain damage or loss of human life sometime in the future. That also then directly feeds into the third reason. There's, of course, a short-term electoral cycle, if it's a democracy, in which, should you spend money now, that drags away resource from something else you could spend it on for something that is very unlikely to happen before the next election. Though, of course, if it does happen, then it's a big catastrophe. You might say, autocracies are so much better. And truth told, an autocracy that took that very seriously could seriously outperform a democracy. We all know, of course, the performance of autocracies is extremely varied. Some can be good at that, and the rest is just kleptocracy that just doesn't give a damn about the welfare of the people. Then you have anything and everything in between. And likewise, governments also face myopic behavior. So in the paper that I showed you very quickly, the snippet, the main argument is that what we call disaster propensity explains a good part of the variation. What do we mean by disaster propensity? It is the frequency and the intensity, historically speaking, by which certain hazards hit a certain country. So the more earthquake prone you are, the more earthquakes you historically have had, the more you learn from this experience and the larger the incentive to you can't prevent earthquakes, but you can certainly maybe not fully prevent damage and loss of human life, but you can adapt. Okay, if the same earthquakes that hit regularly Japan hit somewhere where there's far less of a historical record of earthquakes hitting, then the damage would be much larger and the fatalities would be much larger. Japan is actually a very good example of how it manages, how well, on the whole, it manages to deal with the significant hazards that they face, predominantly, but not only from earthquakes and tsunamis. Okay, so that's the main argument. Of course, holding constant hazard magnitude. So for the same magnitude of hazard, the same Richter scale strength of an earthquake, the same intensity of a, say, typhoon, the same rapid rainfall and continuous rainfall that would create a flood. And then in the paper, we argue that small-scale natural disasters are very difficult to prevent against. They're very sort of random. It should be the bigger ones where this effect of disaster propensity plays a bigger role. And in the paper, we look at earthquakes, we look at tropical cyclones, and we look at floods. So this is a quantile regression on the x-axis, and quake propensity, cyclone propensity, and flood propensity on the y-axis. What it shows is the impact on damage. This is economic damage. This is not human lives lost. And on the whole, what you can see that the larger, the bigger the quantile of damage, the bigger the effect of the negative effect of disaster propensity. Meaning, for large disasters, having a large historical propensity of disaster is good in terms of predicting lower damage. Okay, and the causal mechanism that we describe in the paper is essentially there has been both individual and collective learning from these past disasters that creates stronger incentives to do something in terms of prevention and adaptation. It's not perfect, of course. The best, even Japan can be hit by bigger stuff than they expected. You saw this in the 2011 Tohoku and in other things. But generally speaking, there's something good about human beings. If they are punished frequently enough, they do learn from it. That's sort of the story behind it. In this paper here, we look at this in a bit more detail. Look at it focused on one particular type of disaster, which is earthquakes. And here we look at human lives lost, and we look at more how income, regime type, and the state of corruption impacts, conditions, if you like, the impact of disaster mortality. And here you can see the conditioned effect on earthquake mortality. So on the x-axis, you have earthquake propensity. So this is the historical propensity of having been hit by frequent and large disasters, here earthquakes. You have the predicted deaths on the y-axis, and you can see how predicted deaths fall with larger earthquake propensity. So as you move on the x-axis to the right, your predicted fatality on the y-axis comes down, but you can also see that the effect is more pronounced in developed countries, is more pronounced in democratic as opposed to autocratic countries, and is more pronounced in countries where corruption is low. because these are in principle all countries where the learning should work better. Okay, if government is corrupt, then no matter that you have the beautiful building regulations, right, but they're not enforced, and I think that might explain in part the damage in L'Aquila, or it certainly explains to a large extent when you have these horrendous earthquakes in Turkey, why so many people die from it, because none of the buildings actually complied with the building codes, because developers just get away with stuff. Okay, so the next part of what I'm going to talk about puts a little bit of cold water on the, if you like, positive story of learning that I've told you so far. And that is that learning from natural disasters can in fact be a double-edged sword as well. And we take the mortality in the, I believe, 2011 Tohoku tsunami as the case. So how could learning from disasters be a double-edged sword? So investment in protective infrastructure will unfortunately strongly stimulate settlement into hazard-prone areas and creating a false impression of security. So if the government, on the whole, tends to be really, really good at preventing natural disasters, then people have no longer any incentive to stay away from the flood-prone areas, to stay away from the fault lines of earthquakes, to stay away from where cyclones would hit, to stay away from the dry forests where the wildfires could burn down their houses, because, well, haven't they learned this, that our government is really good at dealing with things, is really good at preventing natural disasters, is really good at mitigation. Now, this works well for most of the time, right? And that's, of course, good. The trouble is when it hits beyond the capacity, beyond what has been expected, beyond what has been prepared for, then, of course, the impact will be worse still. Because there are more individuals with more economic assets in disastrous way, and they are lured into this false sense of security that nothing will happen because we have such a brilliant disaster prepared system in place, don't we? So what we find here, this is the predicted effect of historical tsunami mortality on mortality. So predicted Tohoku mortality, this time, unfortunately, it's a different paper. So now mortality is on the x-axis. I'm sorry for that. It was the other way around in the other papers. I didn't even realize until I see this now. It doesn't matter, except it confuses you. And you have historical tsunami mortality, I believe, in the 20th century, since 1933, on the y-axis. And what you can find here is that launch, that no one sees that, so I don't know why pointing to what's there. I'll explain it in words. You know, if you had very high historical tsunami mortality, these are municipalities where previously tsunamis have hit and have killed people. Okay, in those municipalities, the individuals are much more attuned to, oh my God, if the tsunami warning hits, you know, we run. Okay, we don't stay behind that protective seawall thinking nothing will happen. There will be a protective seawall, but who knows? We run up the hill out of harm's way. Whereas in those municipalities where either no one has ever died from a tsunami in recent memory, or very few people have died, these were the municipalities where real fatalities happened in 2011, because people did not take it sufficiently seriously. Nothing has happened in living memory. Why should something happen now? That's the kind of thinking that goes through people's mind. So unfortunately, learning from natural disasters in the past, from disaster propensity, if you like, can be both beneficial but it can also be a double-edged sword. It can be negative learning, if you like. Very briefly, and then I hand over to the next speaker. What are the implications for Europe? So I mean, I made this up on Sunday as I put the slides together. I've not actually done any sort of deep research on it, but from what I know about the world and having done work on that, on the whole, and I will qualify it in a moment in my last slide, but on the whole, Europe is blessed with relatively low rates of hazard, okay, compared to, say, Asia or other places where natural disasters hit, even where natural hazards are larger and natural disasters hit much more frequently. So in principle, this should be good news for Europe. Less damage, less fatalities. We have high per capita income by comparison. That's not so good on damage, because with high per capita income typically comes wealth, economic wealth, which means it comes, you know, very valuable assets that then get hit by natural disaster. But it's very good on fatalities. There's a very strong correlation between per capita income and fatalities from natural disasters, meaning richer countries really have managed to keep fatality rates low, whereas on the whole, the large fatalities happen in poor countries. We are democratic, at least in most parts of Europe, still. God knows for how long. And that should be good in terms of mitigating. And on the whole, we have low corruption, though, you know, Italy has its problems, particularly that part of Italy. I don't know about Valencia, actually. And you will enlighten us about Valencia. However, if you listen to what I said in the last 10 minutes or so, and if you buy into the story that I gave you, it's great that there are low hazards whenever that hazard strikes, but that also means that there is low disaster propensity, right? There is no reason to really think, oh, yeah, it's problematic, it's dangerous, we must adapt, we must prevent, we must learn from the past. So that all other things equal would mean when a hazard hits, and there's very low disaster propensity, damage and fatalities should be large. Okay? And the low historical damage and fatalities also generate some sort of negative learning and hazard maladaptation. This can come from both high, well, in the following sense, it's sort of the double-edged sword of learning again. On the whole, not much happens in Europe, right? So what could possibly go wrong? Well, I guess the people in Valencia found out the really hard way of what can go wrong and spectacularly go wrong. Even though not all that much had happened in the decades before, though, of course, it was not entirely unpredictable, the event. Okay, it's not the first time that something like this on a lower scale has happened. Last slide. A little bit how this links to climate change. So Europe faces relatively low and stationary hazard rates for disasters that are largely they're either completely or largely unaffected by climate change. So there are not many earthquakes, there are not many tsunamis, there are not many volcanoes. Though on tsunami, I remind you that loads of people died in Lisbon and other places in the 755 earthquake tsunami. But on the whole, you compare this to Japan, it's laughable, right? I mean, the Japanese would love to have our earthquake and our tsunami hazard rates. We have, however, and that qualifies a little bit my assertion that I made that Europe is blessed by low hazard rates. We have intermediate to high hazard rates for disasters that are now exacerbated by climate change. Think of floods, think of storm surges, Of course, not hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons, but floods and storm surges, landslides and avalanches, as the Swiss have found out in Platan or whatever the name is, droughts and wildfires. And so the segue to you, Maria, I believe there is credible scientific evidence that that event in Valencia, the climatic event in Valencia last year, was certainly made more likely, and once it occurs, was made more intense by the intense heating that particularly the Mediterranean Sea has experienced, particularly, I believe, in that year. So over to you.
Reload to the computer.
Yeah.
I mean,
Let's
change my
slides.
slides.
No.
I'm always a bit anxious about the computer because
Please don't.
before, okay, works.
So just making sure I'm sharing.
I will share.
Is it right? Everyone is looking the other side of it.
The microphone is working because I'm the.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you can just use.
This one?
I wanted to add.
Okay.
This one? This one?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay. Okay, so good evening. Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Cañada Blanch Foundation and the London School of Economics for inviting me to participate in this conference. In particular, I would like to thank Simona Iammarino for her kind welcome and her help at all times. Well, let's start. Very much has been written about the disaster known as the Valencia Dana. Being here today is an opportunity for me to reflect on what happened and what has happened throughout this year. Without losing sight of the theme or title of this workshop, I would like to pose a series of questions which I will answer from the geographical perspective that defines me as a researcher and as academic. So let's start. The first question, what happened? On October 29 last year, 2024, a series of physical and human circumstances led to a catastrophic flood of enormous magnitude that affected much of the province of Valencia and southeast of Albacete, causing 237 deaths, 229 in the province of Valencia, and more than 20 billion euros in material losses. The Dana, isolated depression in high atmospheric levels, caused torrential rains in the inland area of Valencia. The sea, with temperatures of over 30 degrees Celsius, provided the initial heat and humidity necessary to set the whole process in motion. The intense rains, with records of over 700 liters per square meter, like a tropical hurricane, is huge. In some inland areas, caused flash flooding. It is important to bear in mind that it rained at the headwaters of rivers and ravines, not in the overflow area, which explains the low perception of risk at that time. My second question, where? The storm affected the south of the province of Valencia, but the most devastating flooding was concentrated in the south of the Valencia metropolitan area. Those towns in the south of the main city, the Valencia city, were flooded when the El Pollo, La Saleta, and Picassent ravines and the Magro River overflowed. This is a densely urbanized, so in this picture you can see how it was. In the south of the city of Valencia is a densely urbanized area where a significant part of the region's industry and commerce is concentrated. Ground zero coincides with the so-called Lorta Sud region, part of the metropolitan area of Valencia, which has a long agricultural tradition, but currently has more than 2,200 hectares of industrial estates, traffic of more than 120,000 vehicles per day, and more than 8,500 heavy vehicles also per day. These municipalities grew from 1970 onwards with the arrival of immigrants from all over Spain and in search of employment. Half of the homes were built between 1979 and 2000, occupying agricultural land and resulting in disconnected planning with little or no vision for the future. Today, they are residential cities with a high percentage of immigrants from abroad, where more than 75% of the population lives and works or studies in a different municipality. The communication infrastructures, you can see them more or less in the picture, have a radial structure from the main city Valencia to its periphery, which are transversal to the flow of water and have acted as barriers. A significant part of this area, is classified as being at high risk of flooding. So it wasn't a surprise. Why was it a catastrophe? The rain began early in the morning. The alert was activated at 8:11 p.m. It was also a preventive message sent through the ES alert system to all mobile phones in the province. However, at that time, many towns had already been flooded for hours, and there were many people on the road returning from work. Some institutions and organizations acted on their own initiative, such as the University of Valencia, which, in view of the weather forecast, suspended classes the day before. Also, the mayor of an inland town, Utiel, did the same. So I just want to say that we had enough information. The impact can be summarized in 3 figures. Well, we have a lot of information, but 3 main figures. 229 deaths, 75 municipalities affected, and 76,000 homes affected, and many other figures. Had this happened before? Your question. Yeah. Mediterranean civilization has settled in this area because of their access to water and fertile land. There have been significant floods throughout history, although never ever with the intensity of the 2024 storm. This suggests that the increase in atmospheric temperature is the cause of its high intensity. Other significant floods in the area include the 1957 flood that inundated the city of Valencia and led to the construction of a new canal in the south of the city to divert water from the river Turia that crosses the city, the main city, so that its floods would not affect the city. This canal has now served as a barrier to the Pollo flood, saving, in theory and in practice too, the city of Valencia. Another example of flooding was the so-called Cañada Tows in 1982, when the Xúquer River overflowed the reservoir and flooded a significant part of the Ribera region. This episode led to the implementation of an automatic hydrological information system to provide real-time information on rainfall, temperature, amount of water stored in reservoirs, and flowing water. It was launched in Valencia for the first time in Spain, but now it exists in every single river in Spain. A more recent example is the Segura flood in Alicante in 2019. In response to the disaster, the so-called Renace plan or Plan Renace was designed. A comprehensive plan involving all social agents for water management in an area that suffers from periodic floods was developed. And this is also connected with your speech. The floods of October last year broke the downward trend in fatalities from major flooding events in the Valencian community. For example, the Turia flood caused 81 deaths, the Xúquer flood caused 38 deaths, and the Segura flood only 7. Could it, the following question, could it have been avoided? Well, science and forecasting did not fail. The decision-making was inadequate. The rain and flooding could not have been prevented. It was an exceptional event. The deaths could have been prevented with a timely warning. 18 months before the disaster, the European Union launched the ES Alert Citizen Prevention and Warning System linked to the 112 emergency service. In the case of Spain, this tool was deployed throughout the country, financed by the European Union Next Generation funds, and managed by the autonomous communities, the regions. Therefore, the necessary regulations to protect people in times of emergency exist in the European Union, exist in Spain, and in the Valencian community. On the other hand, civil society organized itself and responded quickly to the catastrophe. What went wrong? Political decision-making at the regional level, mainly for 3 reasons. They underestimate the danger, warned of days in advance by the meteorological services, they raised the alarm too late, and were unable to coordinate and cooperate at different levels of government in the emergency, but also in the reconstruction. So what have we learned? The European Union offers the civil protection mechanism. In 2024, last year, this mechanism was activated 58 times. So they have experience enough. There is also the European Union Emergency Response Coordination Center, from which Spain requested 50 technicians and 100 teams to clean up the mud from the flood. In addition, the European Union has the Copernicus satellite monitoring system to gather information at the time of an emergency. To all this must be added the European Union Solidarity Fund, the European Investment Bank, that provides loans for the reconstruction, among many other instruments. In Spain, there are mechanisms in place to coordinate early warning system for the population, including the so-called CECOPI, which is the Integrated Operational Coordination Center, which is convened at regional level and is responsible for making decisions at the time of an emergency. In Spain, the Ministry of Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge has flood risk maps for the whole country, as well as various guides and plans, a lot of them, to prevent the impact of floods and other extreme phenomena due to the climate change. There are also various laws, including the 2021 Law on Climate Change and Energy Transition, which, among other issues, establishes the guidelines to be considered in water planning and management in Spain. In the Valencian community, we have this plan. the so-called Patricova in Spanish, the Sectoral Territorial Action Plan on Flood Risk Prevention. The Patricova has a map viewer, among any other tools or instruments, has a map viewer that any citizen can consult. On the other hand, collective action has proven able of reacting extremely quickly to a disaster. Citizen organizations like cultural, sport, youth association, etc., immediately sprang into action to respond to the emergency. The social capital of the affected areas was immediately activated, demonstrating enormous resilience and empathy towards the victims. This collective action has shown a great capacity for social impact and transformation. What have we not learned? An opportunity has been missed for all these things, no? To develop regenerative, resilient, and sustainable public policies that are innovative and based on scientific knowledge. Furthermore, an opportunity has been missed to involve citizens in ensuring that improvements in emergency prevention are appropriate for the region and the society that inhabits it. An opportunity has also been missed to recover local wisdom and the memory of water. And also an opportunity has been missed to act in a coordinated manner between different levels of government. Let's see. Reconstruction plans have just been approved, but the regional government and the national government have produced different plans that are not coordinated. Local governments are acting in isolation without collaborating on general planning with neighboring municipalities. There are too many political clashes that fuel irresponsible and unsustainable polarization strategies and prevent any public policy that requires cooperation between administrations. A culture of collaboration is needed, which currently seems, in my opinion, impossible. How do we prepare for the future? We are finishing. The Spanish government has launched a state pact on climate change, which is work in progress. It is necessary to update risk mapping at all levels, including the local level. Quite important. It is necessary to prevent, that is, to develop a series of diverse, complementary, and coordinated measures. And I would like to highlight training and information on risk in general, not only the flood, for the entire population. Some municipalities are already working on this. And key question for me, the metropolitan planning is necessary. The metropolitan area of Valencia is a high-density built-up area. It has never ever had comprehensive urban planning, including infrastructure, facilities, and mobility. Political will is needed to forge agreements and reach consensus on protecting the land and its people. We need to trust science. Climate change is a reality that multiplies risks. The Mediterranean is an area already greatly affected by these changes and will be even more in the future. In short, we will prepare for the future by complying with the law, which seems easy, but it is not so easy. As the law prohibits construction in flood-prone areas and guarantees the protection of all people, especially the most vulnerable. Let's go to the conclusion. Lessons we have learned. The European Union has played a key role. Multi-level governance and metropolitan scale planning are necessary. training on risk, accurate information, conducting drills, etc., is essential because we cannot completely change the built environment and people's lives. But we can train them to know the place where they live and know how to act in times of emergency. The risk never ever disappears. It is necessary to promote a culture of risk in order to adapt and protect ourselves, that is, to generate resilience. The Valencia storm, or the Valencia Dana, is an opportunity to promote an urgent public agenda that includes all of the above elements and a few more, so that if it happens again, because it will happen again, no human lives are lost and the economic impact is as low as possible. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm last but not least, and I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to try to make it as fast as possible. So thank you to Simona first for organizing this. It's always important to deal with these topics, especially in places where we think we are secure, although Eric has highlighted how we're not that secure. And I'm going to try to look into the L'Aquila earthquake, but not just in isolation, connecting it to the whole situation of Valencia after the Dana, but also I'm going to be talking about other natural hazards like the earthquake that happened in Umbria in 1997. This is work that I'm not doing alone, so I had the support of Iammarino, who's a professor at the University of L'Aquila, that also helped with some of the slides, especially the ones that look at the economic evolution of L'Aquila. Let me just start if I can. I think I have to press here because otherwise I cannot move the slides. No, it's just pressing here and then this should work. Yeah, okay. No, yes. So let me start with the Valencia flood. So to make a connection to what María Dolores was saying just a moment ago. So this is Valencia on the 30th of October. So the heavy rains, the flash flood took place on the 29th. And on the 30th, everyone woke up to realize the disaster. And it was probably the worst natural hazard in a while in Europe in terms of deaths and lives, cost of lives, in a place that is well developed, democratic, and by all means not particularly corrupt. So I'm linking it to what Eric was saying. And yet, we are in a situation in which relatively little progress has been done in terms of reconstruction and special preparation for what might happen in the future. On the 17th of March, so just 5 months or 5 months and a bit after the flash floods, the now resigned president, although he's still in office provisionally, but resigned president of the region, Carlos Mazón, came out with a plan to approve the new budget with the support of a party, Vox in this case, that is climate skeptic, to say the least, to highlight that we're not going to do anything in terms of promoting or pushing forward the green agenda or green transition, because, as he said, we believe that it's going to be significantly damaging for the economy of Valencia. So how can a place that has suffered the biggest natural hazard in Europe in terms of deaths for quite some time come out with a conclusion that we need to do nothing in order to prevent this from happening again? And of course, this is why it's at the heart of why is it becoming so difficult to actually fight against climate change, to implement a green agenda, and to make sure that, let's say, hazardous events or natural disasters, or you said they're not natural disasters, don't happen at the same level. And of course, what we know is that climate's changing, and it's changing at a much faster pace than everyone would like and probably would have envisaged for quite some time. that most of the reason is anthropic, it's not natural, and that the impact of climate change is uneven, and many parts of Europe, that Eric was highlighting, are becoming far more vulnerable to the risk of climate change. In order to tackle climate change and the temperatures of the Mediterranean, I have stopped going to Sardinia for a couple of reasons on holidays, but mainly because the last time I was there, I could not swim. I love swimming in water temperatures of 31 degrees. I was sweating just 2 minutes after getting into the water. And in order to combat that, we need a strong green transition, and the European Union has given itself a very ambitious program. But of course, also the impact of the green transition or the measures that are needed are going to be uneven. On the whole, with the green transition and we combat climate change, we're going to be better off. But in order to get there, there are going to be individuals and places and firms that are going to benefit in the short term. Others are going to have to adapt in a much more difficult way. And that can trigger discontent, that can trigger reactions that actually reflect a bit what Carlos Maffon did of this or the Thatcher overturn to decide how we can go there. And this can trigger a reaction that leads to situations like the one in Valencia, in which, yes, you have a significant risk. You have had it 3 times, at least in Valencia, for the last 70 years, and yet, so far, a year after, nothing has happened in terms of prevention. And that's one of the risks. And I'm going to try to bring in why we should learn from precedents and try to make sure that we act collectively. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to go back to the case of L'Aquila, a beautiful city in the center of Italy, an hour away from Rome, where now Simona is based, which on the 6th of April 2009 was struck by a devastating earthquake, not a massive one, so it was relatively weak on the weaker scales, the Richter scale, so 6 point something, but it was very shallow. So it created a lot of fracture in a city that is a medieval city. So a lot of these structures were not prepared for such an earthquake. And the city of 70,000, 72,000 at the time, 70,000 today, so it hasn't grown in terms of population, suffered complete devastation, 309 people dead, and a massive economic and social loss. In fact, the whole city was closed. All inhabitants had to leave the city and was closed for the best of 4 years. And that was something we say, can we prevent it? Can we not prevent it? We can't discuss. It's much more difficult with an earthquake. Of course, you can learn and you can become like Japanese, that they have far more stronger earthquakes and the death toll is much lower. Here it was not unexpected because Amatrice has had it, Assisi and Perugia had it. It's an area that is earthquake prone. Whole Italian peninsula, Udine had it not that long ago. And what happened was that there was quick reaction. The government at that time, led by Silvio Berlusconi, reacted quickly. So Silvio Berlusconi appeared a couple of days later and said, we're going to not repeat the mistakes of the past. And the mistakes of the past were saying, comparing to the Campania earthquake of 1920, we're talking about 100 years ago, when people were put in provisional housing, provisional housing, it was mainly containers at the time, and people still live in those containers a century later. So he came and said, we're going to have a project in which we're going to provide decent housing that is earthquake-proof within the area of L'Aquila, not in the city, but within the area. So for all those that have been affected, and that's the Progetto Casa. Casa is houses in Italian, and that was created. The idea that after that, we're going to reconstruct the city center, and we're going to come with packages of economic and financial rescue. And in the short term, we're going to move the G8 summit that was going to take place somewhere else in Italy to the city of L'Aquila, despite the fact that it has been destroyed. So in principle, it looked good. You see the houses there at the bottom, the ones that were constructed. And when you had most of the population had to leave the city, most went to Rome because it's not that far away. Many others went to Pescara and to other neighboring cities. on the other side of the region of Abruzzo. And the question is, how many actually went into those houses? Very, very few. In fact, they were constructed in a very short amount of time. They look nice, but they're in places they were not demanded by the people, and they are in places that no one wants to live. Why would you like to live 5 kilometers away from where your house is? What you want to do is your house to be reconstructed or destruction. So there was no participation. There was, you spoke of this idea of collective action, and there was really no voice. And that was one of the problems that happened, and that was different. I'm going to explain about why do I know so much about L'Aquila, and why does Simona know so much about L'Aquila in a moment. But we were part of the team that the Italian government, not the Silvio Berlusconi government, but the Monti government realized that things were not going well after a few years, that the city was still completely closed, and they decided to call a team of experts, not on earthquakes, not on natural hazards, but on economic development and post-hazard reconstruction from all over Europe to come and help, and with the OECD leading it at the University of Groningen, to come and help with the plans for the reconstruction and the future of L'Aquila. And Simona and I were part of that team. And since I was the only foreigner in the team that spoke Italian, I ended up always having the most difficult tasks. So I was told where others were doing private sector and were doing physical reconstruction, you do the public sector. You go and talk to all the civil servants and then decide whether it was done.
And also to the people, and at some point
Well,
he disappeared among a crowd of very, very angry people. This has to be said, and we were all terrified, seriously terrified.
That was real work. I've been in dodgy places in my life, in places where they are rebel forces and been stopped in roadblocks in the middle of the night and knowing what's going to happen there. I never felt threatened until I went to L'Aquila. We'll tell that later on. But there was a reason. But before going to L'Aquila, I said I have to learn from what has happened in other places. So I went to Umbria. Umbria had on the 20th of September 1987, another devastating earthquake with a much lower death toll. 11 people died, but it was a complete destruction of many villages, fundamentally of the city of Assisi and parts of the city of Perugia, which are the two main cities in the region of Umbria, and it affected the neighboring region of Marche. And there's a big difference between Umbria and L'Aquila. It might not look, because they are very close, probably 150 kilometers as the crow flies. But Umbria is in the north of Italy, L'Aquila is in the traditional Mezzogiorno. And that made a difference. So my question was, I went to talk to quite a few people there, and they told us, yes, what did people want? They mainly wanted to live by their destroyed houses, continue with their daily lives. They were consulted, they participated, they engaged in the plan, and within 2 years, life was more or less back to normal. There was still reconstruction, but the inhabitants were living in most of their rebuilt houses with the support of the government, and economic activity was back to pre-earthquake levels. When Simona and I went to L'Aquila, the city was still closed, completely closed. No one was living in the city, apart from a few that were living in those new buildings that Berlusconi promised and actually delivered, and most of them were outside. So what was done right in Umbria and what was done wrong in L'Aquila? Well, in reconstruction, here's the question, this question of collective action. For L'Aquila, all decisions were fundamentally taken by distant ministries. So with lack of consultation to local stakeholders. In fact, why did we almost get lynched in L'Aquila? Why did the politicians that were with us had to flee, with one exception? And many of them are booed every time I go to L'Aquila for any sort of meeting when they try to explain themselves, for a simple reason that they never consulted the stakeholders. When we presented our plan, it was the first time that the population of L'Aquila was actually gathered in one of the few buildings that remain standing, which was a theatre, which is not an old theatre, but it's a new theatre right outside the main center of the city. By contrast, in Umbria Marche, what happened was there was a direct support to homeowners and firms, and there was a much bigger emphasis demanded by the local population and agreed by the decision makers that the priority was to return people to their places of living. Of course, it affected smaller villages, it was probably easier, and there was less people living, having to move to other sites. I can consult and compare this with the situation in Valencia after the flash floods. I was invited first in December 2024 to go and give a talk and participate in one of these meetings. Then I was again in February, and then finally Cañada Blanch organized our annual forum in Valencia about climate change and climate hazards. And in all those cases, the first time my talk was about you have to involve the stakeholders, you have to involve those that have been affected. And the people that were from the village, well, the villages, actually the suburbs of Valencia, came and said, this is the first time that someone has said it in public. But my question to them was, has anyone come and talked to you? No. February, has anyone come? They appeared again from different, has anyone come and talked to you? No. Third time, in April, has anyone come and talked to you? No. So the situation of L'Aquila was being reproduced in Valencia. And it's taking a long time. I think things are getting better, but I haven't been on top of the issues there. The sense of philosophy in L'Aquila was centralized, it was top down. We as planners know best. We have the solutions. We as government know best. And the emphasis on rapid provision of public goods that no one had demanded. In fact, the problem was that, of course, people wanted to go back to their houses. They didn't want to live outside the city center. And if you are for 4 years living in Rome or in Pescara with mostly relatives, then you don't never come back, or you're less likely to come back. And that led to a massive loss of talent and human capital, brain drain in many places. In Umbria Marche, there was a much more bottom-up approach and a strong bet on maintaining the social networks that were already in the territory and that seemed to have worked better. In L'Aquila, it was massive bureaucracy, complex, not very transparent, and I know why it was not very transparent. I didn't realize until I started doing the interviews, but with constant political conflicts. I did in the range of 70 interviews to different civil servants, some of whom ended up in jail. And the story was always the same. My department and me personally have done everything that is in our power to actually solve the problem, but we haven't managed because there hasn't been any sort of collaboration by everyone else. And they say it in a very convincing way. So when you hear the first time, you believe it. When you hear the second time, you believe it. When you hear the seventh or the eighth time, you start saying, yeah, there's something wrong here. And when you start listening for the 50th time, you just get angry and a bit unprofessional in that. Because it's the same story. It's a lack of collective action. It's everyone for themselves, trying to fend for themselves, and very often, in some cases, using the massive funds that were coming for individual profit. Fortunately, it was the minority, but it was quite a few cases. In Umbria, it was the opposite, very simple systems, tight coordination among different stakeholders, and as a result, a strong civil society involvement in that. The results are clear from an economic perspective. There has been very slow recovery. We're going to get to see some figures in the case of L'Aquila. difficulties to recover a normal life. In fact, now the city is back to normal, and you know it much more. I was there for the 10th anniversary. It was a difficult event we had, but they still wanted me to go back to remember that day in which I was forced, because everyone had to flee, to actually try to commandeer a very angry crowd of people there. And loss of population, economic activity. Only now L'Aquila is getting close to the population it had pre-earthquake times, where it took just 2 years in Umbria. Return to normal life in the case of Umbria in 2 years, and stronger, far more dynamic and more resilient communities. So we can see that this problem has created lack of development. This is the evolution of the earthquake in or the economy. So in this case, the GDP per capita in Abruzzo after the earthquake for a long period. You can see that Abruzzo was, the dark blue is the south of Italy, the dotted line is Abruzzo, which L'Aquila is the capital. And what you see, there was convergence until the mid-1980s with the rest of Italy. And then there's been stability and no, let's say, jump after the earthquake. One thing in Valencia is that we are seeing, and the Bank of Spain published it last week, that there has been a rebound in economic activity just for the sheer amount of investment that has taken place in Valencia to try to help recover. In L'Aquila, there was nothing to be seen like that. And what happened, that mainly all the connections, economic connections of L'Aquila with the rest of the world disappeared. So there was a significant decline in not the connections with the rest of Italy, but also the connections with the rest of the world, so making it a place that became suddenly less attractive for investments. Fundamentally also because it's not just an area at risk, but because there was slow reconstruction and there was a flight of talent to other places. What has continued has been weak employment trends. Many of the measures that have been put in effect have worked, but have worked partially. Particularly, there has been a decline in manufacturing, and the most dynamic sector, and it could be expected, has been construction, engineering, real estate, architecture, anything that has to do with post-earthquake reconstruction. So what we can say is that Abruzzo, that for many of the 1970s, 80s, and 80s, grew significantly and was regarded as one of the part of the Italian economic miracle, has become stagnant after that. So what can we learn from this in terms of the future? Well, if we can learn anything, this is not for disaster prevention, but it's mainly for reconstruction, is that we cannot go as business as usual. We have to change and we have to learn, as Eric was saying, from mistakes and from errors that were happening before. That there needs to be a relatively rapid but participatory integrated reconstruction strategy based on building trust and dialogue with those that have been affected and the stakeholders in the territory. There's a need to give voice to those that have their own future at stake. It was not the future of Berlusconi, and Berlusconi was probably well-intentioned, but it was the future of the citizens of L'Aquila, and they had to be heard, and they were never heard. There's a need to foster systems of public participation and strengthening the decision-making system, creating collaboration. What we saw in L'Aquila, and we are seeing this lack of collaboration between the different administrations in Valencia and the whole of Spain, and a blame game. It's not my fault, it's someone else's fault. Is not the way to actually address any sort of problems with reconstruction. There's a need to build trust, and trust is very often destroyed because people are encouraged to actually buy in places that are hazardous, and then suddenly they realize that they are at risk, and they realize in the worst of circumstances, and increase economic capacity, need to rebuild and rebuild faster and much better. So the sort of Turkish post-earthquake reconstruction that we saw in parts of like the Antioch earthquake 2 years ago cannot be repeated in many parts of the world, and the need to develop integrated strategies. The plans need to be flexible and adaptive. They cannot be set in stone. They can have feedbacks and be interactive. And it's not that you set the plan and people disappear. It has to be a plan that is also with local participation and try to accelerate the return to normal life. Does it mean that they have to go back to the pre-natural disaster condition? Not necessarily, but they have to be given an opportunity to have economic activity, recover their economic activity, and perhaps allow them to reimagine a different economic activity based on what they already have. Because starting from scratch is always far more difficult. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Well, I mean, it's been incredibly integrated. One of the events where, I mean, everyone has tackled different, the academic results of research and then combining two case studies to support what actually Eric was saying. And it seems to me that learning is a very, very difficult process. Even when you are there, you have the experts, you have the political will, you have you don't learn. Because, I mean, in Italy, at least we have these events quite regularly. It depends on the geography. If it is in the south, it's a disaster, but disaster in terms of long-term period, okay? And it's misalignment, it's putting the blame on the others, it's misallocation, misappropriation of funds. In the case of L'Aquila, the money was there. When we arrived 4 years later, the money was already there in the bank, and nobody knew how to spend it for lack of kind of plan and coordination. I would like to, give this last 10-15 minutes recovering the technical disaster we had today, but for any comments or questions from the audience. Yes, please, say your name and affiliation of whatever background, please.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Daniel Beunza. I am a professor of social science and finance at City University, and I am from Valencia myself.
Okay, wonderful.
So this was a wonderful occasion to put together 3 different perspectives. Very interesting. I saw Andres's presentation, something similar when you came to Valencia. Yeah. There was another one in February or something.
The one in April was completely different.
Okay, so, and I came out very convinced, and I am obviously still very convinced. But the one question that I have is, I sometimes wonder whether the recipe of more participation, give voice to the people, which of course is absolutely essential. It's not a little bit like telling somebody who clearly has a overweight problem, has physical problems, has not healthy habits. Well, you should just wake up in the morning and go and exercise. So by the time somebody gets, or a society gets to have that problem of lack of participation, lack of trust, weak civil society, the advice to just improve it, I guess it's just, as if it's just advice, I suppose it's difficult to act on it. So if I was to, travel tomorrow to L'Aquila and offer the advice that you give, I do wonder to what extent they would be able to do something with it. So what practical interventions do you envision to address this situation?
I think all the 3 can.
Should we collect her
Yeah,
questions?
okay, yes, Valentina.
I'm Valentina De Marchi. I'm Italian, but I now live in Barcelona. It's a business school, so I feel very, very connected with what you are presenting. And I just wanted to get back to the point of the climate changes. One of the differences across the many natural disasters that we're talking about And I'm wondering what is your view about, in a way, the non-linear impacts that can have, especially in the learnings. I've been living in Barcelona before and after the Dana, and I can tell that the amount of alerts that now we get changed completely after that. So I'm realizing there is kind of a spatial spillover, right, about these learnings. Definitely in Barcelona, we take that seriously. Unfortunately, right, at the expenses of another region. But it was interesting to realize the difference in terms of population and regulation. So, and I can also expect this to be not necessarily just the neighboring regions, right? But now that social media are out there, I can expect this special spillovers in a way, right, to take place. But I also was wondering about more of non-linear effects in terms of speed, because it's true that we easily don't learn from the past. But if we compare something that happens 15 years ago, something I was not living through, right? Now with climate change, the speed to which identity, but also the speed to which natural hazards are taking place is much faster. So I was wondering if we should expect stronger effect in learning just because, that's one over the other, or what are the expectations, if there is anything also in terms of what was happening in the past that can give us insights about what could happen in the future.
Thank you. Any other question or is there anyone else? So I'll go with those that, yes, you.
I have a question for Andrés. Andrés, I'm Hugo Pardo, a student of
So you are?
Sorry?
You are, sorry?
Hugo Pardo, student of business in Polytechnic University of Valencia. I'm doing a stay here in London. I wanted to ask, before you mentioned about the reconstruction plan, that the right-wing parties, mostly Vox, don't want to make environmental policy and anti-climate change, for example, because they argue could hinder economic activity. And this was kind of contradictory because that very global warming and climate change is responsible for the damage, right? So my question is, the efforts that Valencia could put now into climate change could actually hinder or diminish the risk of future damage, or it's you need a global steer in politics, not only Valencia, because Valencia does this simple, but the rest of the world continues the same direction, could be just like resources and be more damaging to the Valencian economy than just go along with it.
Yes, I wanted to tie the concept of the importance of people's participation and people's experience with the climate skepticism that we're currently now seeing in Valencia. Does politics in Valencia not face the resistance from people who have just been through such a big hazard? And what does this say about political will and where are we headed?
I think, tackling this is already very.
Maybe we go in the same order. I can only really address your question, which is a very interesting and an important one. So there's no doubt that the radiating force of climate change is surprising even climate scientists in its impact, in its non-linearity, and that things just happen that even climate science didn't really. So that the sheer thought that at the end of October, it is 30 degrees temperature in the Mediterranean Sea, that has nothing to do with climate change, it's just absurd, right? Unfortunately, so two things make it difficult though to learn from that. So first of all, human beings find it very hard to learn from things that change rather rapidly and sort of unexpectedly. If I go back to the tsunamis in Japan, one advantage that people there have, there's centuries and decades of learning. In a lot of the municipalities, you will find tsunami stones. What are these? These are essentially pillars with big letters written on them. Be aware of tsunamis. When the warning comes, run up the hills. okay, for everyone to see. Whereas this is a lot more, it's a lot more compressed in time. It happens quite fast. It is more difficult to learn from. It then also gets mixed up into politics and polarized politics. Terrible for learning. So yes, in principle there should be learning, but all these people say it's actually a fake, it's not linked to it, or it costs way too much to do something about it, as the president in Valencia tried to get away with it. But I'm interested in, why did he now resign? Because I'm not actually sure I understood why more than a year later he now actually resigned. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it. So, particularly now, we live almost in a world where learning is almost partisan now, in the sense of either you buy into the story of the ones that you trust that are on your side, or you think it's all fake, right? And the masters of the merchants of doubt, Trump being the maestro of this, they put so much doubt into the minds of normal people that they no longer know who to trust. Is it real? Are those climate scientists, are they not doomed? Are they the hard left that exaggerates and everything? Or are they experts that we should trust and listen to? It all gets mixed up in polarized politics, and that is very bad news for learning.
Who wants to go first? And now you have to also to tell us why, in your opinion, why?
The last meeting.
I don't know why exactly, but because of the people's pressure, clearly. But you know that he's not at home. He's already president. You know that?
He's already
President.
president.
Because he is, como se dice, está en funciones.
Well, he hasn't resigned, but he
But-
is still an acting president.
Still,
Okay.
yeah.
Sure.
Why? Because we are in the hands of the far right party, this Vox party. They need the votes to elect a new president, but they are thinking about, and if not, if they don't make an agreement, kind of agreement, we will go for elections in short, in 6 months. So we are now in this, I don't know. Well, some things related to for instance, to your question. In Valencia, some new regulations of the regional government, and also in Valencia capital city. In these new regulations, the term climate change has disappeared completely. Yeah, because of this far right or extreme right party. And not only disappear, but for those who argue that climate change is in the root of the dana, are branded as ecological fanatics. We are in this history now. So the regional government does not consider it necessary to promote measures to protect the landscape, and they have permitted new constructions in risk areas with the excuse of their reconstruction from up later, from the dana. See, right? So, what can we do? People's participation, civil organizations participating. Well, I don't really know how to do that. It's really very, very difficult, but I'm working on that. I don't think people have not been asked as they say, as they told you when you went last year or I think people has been asked and some municipal governments or city councils have developed a program to know what people want, but not in every single municipalities because of this lack of coordination and cooperation and so it's 1 year, only 1 year since the done, only 1 year after listening how it worked in L'Aquila. 1 year is not a long time. It's very short time.
Yeah.
So I hope next months we will be able to improve our civil participation or economic growth and so on. And Valencia is also different because this has happened unfortunately in the metropolitan area of Valencia. So I don't think economic or businesses are going to disappear and they are going, I don't know, to the city, to another city or to the city center. This is already the city center. It's part of, it's all, it's all like a huge city, it's a metropolitan area. So we are recovering the businesses, recovering life, but step by step, very slowly. That's
Okay, so let me see on participation and then the other question. Here's a problem of governance and governance failure and institutional failure throughout, because yes, María is right that there are consultations.
Yeah.
But we are 1 year after the Rana, and 1 year might be, in comparison to L'Aquila, a small amount of time, but in the life of people, it's a long time.
Yeah.
And it does continue over a long time. And in L'Aquila, there was no consultation. It was not that there was no consultation. There was some consultation, mainly done by civic organizations. But this is not something that can be done by a single municipality or by a single individual group. You need to have coordination between local civic society, local economic stakeholders, social stakeholders, political stakeholders at the very local level across different municipalities, and vertically between the local governments, the government of the region of Valencia, and the national government and the European Union government. And the perception, not the perception, that has been failing, and that has been failing completely. 1 year on, the color, and this is where you were talking about the polarization, the learning has become so polarized that in the face of our disaster, what prevails is the small politics with a P, not the policy solutions, not the solutions. And of course, you're going to say, well, do we need more participation? If you do development against the will of the people whose lives are you going to affect, you're not going to achieve by any sort of rule, any sort of results. And of course, the question is that there has been a growing mistrust that then explodes with the data. Because why should they trust decision makers that first cannot talk to one another, that clearly seem to be looking for personal short-term gain, which is political or otherwise, and not for collective sort of solutions, and that have failed them historically, because the south of Valencia was flooded on the 29th of October 2024, and not the city of Valencia. It was because there was a plan that was actually designed and implemented after the 1957 disaster, that was partially implemented, that saved the city of Valencia, the city center, because the city, you're right. You're right, this is the city of Valencia, the agglomeration of Valencia. But there was no money or no political will or no interest over the remaining 60 years to actually implement it to the south of Valencia. Why should they trust decision makers that have allowed them to put close to 200,000 people on the floodplain, and a floodplain that they knew, and most of the buildings there are not buildings that were built like in Aquila in the 18th century. They were built in the 1970s and 1980s, and if not later. Why should they trust now new decision makers that say we should try to return all these riverbeds to the natural conditions? Of course, you can do that when you have no population there, you have limited amount of population. But when you have a significant chunk of the third largest city of Spain, there is very, very difficult. So in the end, we have this dialogue of the death, which is not working. Ugo's question in a bit, his question, why is this happening? Well, I'm going to talk more than about Valencia. I'm going to talk about why is it becoming so difficult to tackle collectively an urgent problem like climate change from a societal perspective. And I'm going to put the example not of Valencia, but you can imagine the situation is relatively similar. I'm going to put the case of Almeria. Almeria, there's only one part in Europe that has got a semi-desert climate, and that is the province of Almeria. Rainfall there's about 200 millimeters per year, which is virtually nothing. And it's an area of Andalusia that has grown significantly. Before it just did films and nothing much more than that. For two reasons, it's now become one of the, I was going to say the bread basket. It's not a bread basket, it's the vegetable basket of food for Europe. So many of the tomatoes and lettuces that you buy here in Tesco, they come from Almeria, and they're produced intensively in what is called the sea of plastic. And the second is in an area with no water. And the second is tourism. So when you go to Almeria and you talk to the people in Almeria and you ask, are you worried about climate change? They are worried about climate change because they realize that the temperatures are warmer, there's less water, the vegetation is disappearing, and that's making flash floods far more frequent and far more devastating. So they are really worried about that. But then they say, well, we need to take measures, and we have this sort of plan, which is the green transition at the level of Europe. But then say, hang on a minute, that implies that Eric, instead of going on holidays to, I don't know, Brazil or the Canaries, wherever he goes, he's going to take his holidays in Great Yarmouth. Why? Because air transport is highly polluting. And instead of buying his tomatoes in Tesco or in Sainsbury's from Almeria, he's going to have to go and buy local, which is going to have a significant impact on the livelihoods. And that's what is being sold. And when you look at the programs of these Eurosceptic parties, not Eurosceptic, sorry, climate skeptic or climate deniers parties, I would recommend that all of you do it, because they all come to one simple sentence that is proving very, very effective in terms of voting and making sure that all the objectives that we have in terms of achieving or try to mitigate climate change are going to be very difficult to achieve. Because what it comes down is, while green parties or ecologists are worried about the end of the world, we in our party are worried about the end of the month. And how are you going to make it to the end of the month? And I got a paper that has been circulating that if you have a lot of climate hazards, you're far more sensible to vote for parties that are in favor of a green transition. If you have less climate hazards and more economic risk, you're more likely to vote against. The question is, when you are vulnerable to climate change and also you have an adaptation, or you have a cost, short-term cost of adaptation to the green transition, then the tendency is to vote less for green parties or parties, mainstream parties that are concerned with climate change, and vote more for climate denialists. In the end, it's all about what happens in the short term more than in the long run. The green transition is going to have significant investment and is going to provide a public good, which is hopefully to reverse climate change and make our cities and regions far more livable than they are now. They're going to be in the near future. It's also going to have, because it's massive investment, significant economic benefits, but that's at the end of the line. What you have to analyze is where those benefits are going to accrue and those costs in the short term. And if most of the benefits are concentrated in places that are already well off, and a lot of the short-term costs actually accrue in places where it doesn't rain but it pours because they have a lot of other problems. They're less developed, or they already are vulnerable because they have all industrial sectors or whatever. In the end, what is this going to make is to derail a very necessary train, which is the train of the green transition, to make sure that we end up in 2050 or wherever with a far more net zero and a far more livable planet. I'll leave it there.
Well, I think that we had really very, very insightful conversation here that will continue. Will continue also because, I mean, the general political direction in Europe is not really going into the right direction. Let's put it this way.
In Europe and in the world.
In Europe and in the world, but this is talking about the European regions. I mean, what you were saying about Japan, it's really interesting. It's also cultural is always a very vague word to explain these things, but there is. I mean, and thinking about Valencia and L'Aquila, there is Umbria, explain a lot about the local culture, which is, even in the same place, in the same nation state, explain a lot why some community gets together, some other don't, right? The mistrust, historical, and so it's very, very big topic that we hope to continue this conversation with many of you. Thank you very, very much to Eric, Andrés, and María Dolores for an amazing presentation and thoughtful insights for all of us. Thank you.
Let me just say one thing, and with my hat as director of the Cañada Blanch Center. Thank you very much for coming to this event. Thank you very much to all of you that are there on the screen. You can follow us on YouTube. You can follow us on X. You can follow us on LinkedIn, especially. And remember, we have constant events. Next week is the next one, so don't miss it. It's the fellows, the Cañada Blanch fellows, the Miguel Dos fellows, that are going to be presenting the research they are conducting while here. That's Thursday in the evening, so please don't miss it. Thank you very much. Say hello over there.
It's